You develop financial structures where any drop in income or a rise in interest rates will transform some firms to Ponzi financing.
And I said, well, did you predict the global financial crisis? And he said, no. And I said, well, on your own definition, you're an idiot. Why shouldn't I model the world as consisting of people like you?
The influential contrarian economist, Steve Keen.
Brilliant economist that criticizes much of modern economics.
The research fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at University College in London.
He is someone that each and every one of us has to listen to, whether we agree or disagree.
Steve Keen.
So in the previous lectures, I've led up to the point of saying we have to analyze the economy as a complex system. And that, of course, was what is a complex system. And intriguingly enough, I hadn't actually provided a definition. The definition I came up with there is that a complex system is often a very simple system. So complex does not mean complicated. And that's an important point I try to illustrate in today's lecture. As soon as you're in a complex system, you are not dealing with the system in which equilibrium tells you anything other than the broad characteristics of the system. It certainly doesn't tell you where the system is going to be. And you can't understand it by reductionism. You can't reduce it back to its component parts and then understand them. But I want to start by giving a simulation of the very first discovered model of complex system. That honor belongs to the remarkable, one of the great mathematicians for all time, Henri Poincaré, a French mathematician. And he proved the existence of what we now call complexity when he solved the three-body problem by proving it couldn't be solved. The idea was forgotten until Lorentz rediscovered it by accident in the 1960s, working on meteorology. He wanted to illustrate to his fellow meteorologists that they were using two sorts of things mostly at the time he wrote this paper, either linear models of the weather or their models which had pattern matching. Now, what he did to make his point was whoever took those equations, reduced them to three very simple first-order differential equations. And this is what they look like. Now, Lorentz expected something interesting out of this, but he didn't know. So he wrote a computer program, probably in Fortran, to simulate it. And the machine that it produced, that did the simulation, worked at 6 decimal places of internal accuracy. That's to be compared to modern computers, which probably open about 25 or 30 or more decimal places. And what he got was a column of numbers printed at 4 decimal places because that was the printer. So he gave them back to the technician who entered the numbers and said, redo it starting from this number. And when he simulated it, this is what he got. Of course, not a pretty graph here, of course, that a set of numbers, but identical for quite some time, and then suddenly started, and ultimately they were completely unrelated to each other. They were complex aperiodic cycles out of a deterministic system, and hence the title it gave to the paper. It was simply unbelievable, given the understanding we had before then, that such things were possible. But he showed that it was. So there we have, there's just three equations, 3 variables, and off we go, and absolutely nothing happens because they've started the model in equilibrium. And then you can see that all 3 variables are propelled away from the equilibrium, but they don't get propelled into outer space. They start to cycle, and that's where the concept of the strange attractor came from. So the key features there, first of all, nonlinear interactions there. So those are your nonlinearities. The system is extremely simple, just those 3 variables and 3 parameters, but all 3 equilibria are unstable. But the system doesn't break down. That's completely unlike what neoclassical economists think still about the nature of unstable equilibria. So you get aperiodic cycles coming. Each cycle is different. Now, this is something which before Lorentz's work, and unfortunately still after it, because economists don't read outside their own literature, the general expectation of economists was, once they thought about this thing, the complex meant complicated. Because physical systems were simple, they wouldn't have complex outcomes, but human social systems are complicated, so they would have complex outcomes. Now, what Lorentz is showing instead is that complexity exists even in simple systems. And also the corollary of that is some of what we see as the complicated behavior of capitalism may also have equally simple foundations. And as soon as you've got them, you're in a complex world, and that is, you're in a complex world because nothing is linear. So a straight line, for example, you draw a straight line, no, you haven't, it's nonlinear because you didn't draw it from one side of the universe to the other. So the fact that it stops at some point is a nonlinearity. And then interactions are also normally nonlinear. But there's multiplicative interactions everywhere in macroeconomics. If you work out the wage bill, if you're trying to work out aggregate profit, then it's going to be the profit of all the companies, which is additive, minus wages for all the employees, which is multiplicative in the sense that you've got both the number of employees, which is a function of economic activity, and the wage rate, which is a function of economic activity. So you put the two together, and you've got two variables multiplied by each other. Private debt level is also the level of private debt divided by GDP. That's another nonlinearity. Okay? So they cause very different dynamics when you're far from equilibrium compared to when you're near equilibrium. So near equilibrium, linear terms will dominate. And this can be shown mathematically. But far from equilibrium, the nonlinear terms dominate. And what you get out of that is interaction between those two extremes that gives you instability near the equilibrium, but stability far from it. In other words, not stability in the sense that you don't get crazy high values at various times, but you don't get values that say the system break down necessarily. I do get that in my model of a debt deflation. And that's one reason to avoid a debt deflation. You get to a corner solution you can't escape from. So what we should be doing in economics is modeling complex systems. But economists are locked in a 19th century mindset where they still expect equilibrium to be stable. So one of the earliest instances of this is when Roy Harrod, he did a lot of disturbing things to mainstream economics, fascinating character. I should learn his biography far more closely than I have. But he managed to disturb economists by bringing up the concept of marginal revenue, which put a big hole in the supply and demand analysis that economists were doing up until that time. When you look at the model that Ramsey wrote, that all these models were based on, it's unstable. But anyway, back to how they reacted to this. They also have linear models. This is Olivia Blanchard, who I had some polite exchanges with back in the post-crisis days. He's ceased being polite since then. But they said we had a system in which they had a model where cycles were regular and essentially self-correcting. So here's Lorenz's model with one or more of the ODEs turned off. So I run it, and you can see I've started from a different point, which is not an equilibrium. So if you cut out the third dimension, you lose the interesting behavior. You can't actually see it. Then I turn it on back on again and show the same forces are still there. So you have to analyze the whole system. You can't analyze it bit by bit. And simulation, as I've done there, is the easiest way to see how it behaves. But you actually have an enormous what they call phase space around the equilibrium. So, but because of the obsession with equilibrium, they didn't even want to know about. So they impose stability on an unstable equilibrium. And this is where the God mode of neoclassical economics has come from. But what it really means is we're assuming every agent here can predict the future because they have a model in their head which is identical to the model I've just built of the economy. And since what they do is based on the model of the economy, all the capacity of any outside force to change the equilibrium outcome is removed. So this is the great tragedy. I mean, I hope we could recruit some physicists to join us when the kind of physics began back in the early 2000s. But the physicists are stuck with their own little group and mainly looking at applying the techniques from nuclear physics to financial sector data. So we just don't have the development going on there. So please join us. It's just, that's one reason I'm giving these courses. One of my best mates, if any of you watch the show on the Saturday that I do with Ty Keynes and Mike Rizicki, Mike's one of my best mates in economics in general. And he talks about doing the system dynamics. You'll take a complex system, you'll break down components of it, and what you'll do as part of the testing that component is work out its equilibrium and its own interpersonal dynamics, and then you slot it back into the big system. So you have to be aware of both. And what economists have done is presume we don't want disequilibrium anywhere, so we assume we just impose equilibrium everywhere, and we're quite happy to assume that rationality means you can predict the future. But I gave a talk in what they call the Western Economics Association of the United States, had its conference in Brisbane, which is pretty Western, 1 year, and I went along to it, gave my paper on Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And as I was going through explaining Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, getting more and more agitated. And he finally couldn't hold himself in the middle of my presentation. He blurts out, but you're assuming people are idiots. And I said, well, did you predict the global financial crisis? And he said, no. And I said, well, on your own definition, you're an idiot. Why shouldn't I model the world as consisting of people like you? And he then chased me out of the room. I mean, the thing is, I realized how insulting this was. I said it very softly. It's twice I've managed to do that when I should have said something loudly for the sheer dramatic effect. But anyway, he followed me out of the room, and I just, what's the point of talking to these characters? And he shouts to me, but we've got to make some simplifying assumptions. And I said, mate, you've got to learn the difference between a simplifying assumption and a fantasy. It's maybe not a bad time to finish up. So thank you, everybody. Okay, everybody. See you all maybe tomorrow or maybe next week. Bye. If you're like many other truth seekers and want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks, you'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to apply.stevekeenfree.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to apply.stevekeenfree.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.